In this video, I'll be covering 5 draft lessons you can learn from Secrets of Strixhaven to help you find more success in future sets. First, mana rocks can be great. A mana rock is a card like Potioner's Trove. It's typically going to be an artifact that taps for mana, so in the case of Potioner's Trove, it's 3 mana, it comes into play, it can add 1 mana of any color, and then you can also tap it to gain 2 life, activate only if you've cast an instant or sorcery spell this turn. Potioner's Trove is very similar to a card like Manalith, which is a card we've seen in historic sets like Hour of Devastation, which was 10 years ago, and in that set, in an older environment where cards were generally much less powerful, Manalith was a card you never wanted to put into your deck. So why would a card like Potioner's Trove be good today? Well, the extra ability actually does make a significant difference in the playability of the card. It makes it have some relevance in helping you stabilize once you've already used it for mana, and that little extra trinket text might not seem like much, but being able to notice that Potioner's Trove is good and Manalith is really bad is the sort of thing that can help you get an edge in future sets where if you just go in assuming all of these artifacts are going to be bad because Manalith was bad and it's a very similar card, that can be debilitating in future sets. One of the reasons that Potioner's Trove is very good and Manalith is very bad is that Potioner's Trove plays into the second point I want to make, which is multicolored decks are getting easier to play. In Secrets of Strixhaven, when first reading through the cards, there are the cards with the Converge mechanic, cards with Arcane Omen, like Arcane Omens and Snarlsong, which get much better if you play them in 4 or even 5 color decks because they just power themselves up. In the case of Arcane Omens, you can make your opponent discard tons of cards for just 5 mana if you're able to cast it for 4 or 5 colors, or even just 3 colors in a general sense. And Snarlsong, if you are casting for 4 or 5 colors, is a very, very strong card, and if you're casting it for 3 or less colors, it's not particularly great. And the fact that you have these cards that reward you for spending multiple colors of mana is a big deal because these cards in some sets would not be very playable because there just wouldn't be the mana fixing to support them. You would be much more rewarded for playing 2-color linear strategies instead of these expansive multicolor decks that can splash a lot of cards and play these sorts of payoffs. And the fact that in this set, dual lands are in 50% of the packs, replacing the basic land slot, undoubtedly helps. The fact that there are cards like Potioner's Trove undoubtedly helps. And going forward, looking for these multicolored payoffs and thinking, hey, maybe these are worth trying out earlier in the format. Maybe these cards are really strong and worth prioritizing early in my events, like pre-releases or things like that. Just keeping an eye out for them at the very least, because it is getting easier and easier to splash as they start putting more and more mana fixing into these sets. Of course, some sets aren't going to have a dual land in 50% of packs, and that's also something worth noting for the splashability of cards and how many colors you should play, but they do this often enough that it's worth noting and worth keeping in mind when determining how many cards to splash, and it does seem to be getting more and more frequent over time. Next, be open to unconventional archetypes. Secrets of Strixhaven has some of the wackiest archetypes of any environment. For example, red-white can play a very mid-ranging to control game when in typical formats it is the aggressive deck. A card like Pursue the Past is not a card that you would generally love in a lot of red-white decks in a lot of formats because you want to be playing cards that affect the board state, creatures, combat tricks, removal spells for your opponent's cards. Pursue the Past is a very slow way to filter your draws, eventually get some card advantage, make sure you don't flood out in the late game. A card like Primary Research, which loved being in red-white decks, would be the sort of card that in some formats would be very slow and eventually you would get overpowered by other decks, but here it's the sort of card where it's an engine piece for your red-white mid-range or red-white control deck and just gives you a lot of inevitability in an archetype that doesn't typically have that. And so even though in the original Strixhaven, red-white wasn't particularly great at fulfilling its Leaves the Graveyard theme, being open to that archetype going into Secrets of Strixhaven let you really capitalize on the power level in the red-white archetype, especially early in the format where a lot of players were having this kind of hangover effect from the previous Strixhaven where they're like, oh, red-white didn't get there in the last one, I'm not even going to try it this time. Being open to these unconventional archetypes is huge. Similarly, black-green in this format was a life gain aggro deck instead of like a mid-range or grindy deck that black-green often is. Sure, it did have some grindy elements, but a card like Bogwater Lumerate, when you read it, you're like, oh, I'm gaining life so I can make the game go long so that I can eventually stabilize and win with my value cards. What it was actually trying to do was use cards like Thornfist Striker, which turn that life gain with the infusion payoff to be creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample as long as you gained life this turn. Things of that nature. Or you'd have creatures that grew and got +1/+1 counters, or other like temporary effects that helped you out when you were trying to push damage and be on your turn. There were cards that gained you life when you attacked because of these pest tokens that were running around that gained life whenever you attacked. And these cards want you to attack, they reward attacking. And so by realizing that black-green was supposed to be built as this more aggressive deck could really help you build the deck more properly to leverage these sorts of payoffs instead of just defaulting to my black-green decks are almost always grindy value decks. I'm just going to play a black-green grindy value deck. And so understanding unconventional archetypes is really important in formats. The next lesson is 5 archetype sets need their own draft style. The first important element of a 5 archetype set is because there are 5 archetypes and there's 8 drafters, generally there's going to be one of the archetypes or sometimes even 2 of them where you can be the only person at the table drafting your archetype. If you just imagine a typical breakdown, there's 5 archetypes. 2 players draft archetype A, 2 players draft archetype B, 2 players draft archetype C. That leaves 1 player for archetypes D and archetypes E, which hopefully makes sense. But basically, if you are one of those players that are the only one drafting your archetype, you can get incredibly rewarded. So staying open longer really does pay you off. Another big side effect is that these multicolored cards that aren't particularly splashable, a card like Sonar is not a card you're trying to splash because it's not a card you want to really top deck on turn 10 necessarily, because you want to be able to play it on turn 2. That's a large portion of the card's power. Similarly, a card like Scolding Administrator, it's a lot of its power is the fact that if you play it on turn 2, it can snowball a game. These cards do go way up in your pick order because there's only 5 archetypes. So instead of being like, oh, if I take Sonar, it'll fit into one of the 10 viable archetypes, it'll fit into one of 5 viable archetypes. And that's like doubling its chances of making your deck almost, and that is a big deal. And so adapting your draft style when there are 5 primary archetypes instead of 10 primary archetypes is a very important aspect of succeeding in these formats. And they do have these formats with only 5 archetypes fairly frequently, and so that is something to know as well. Then the final tip from this set that has been seen in some other formats as well is board impact on spells is a big deal. And what do I mean by that? A card like Cost of Brilliance, it's 2 and a black, sorcery, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. This +1/+1 counter makes a much bigger impact than you would think. Similarly, Render Speechless, 2 white/black, sorcery, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an on-land card from it, that player discards that card, put 2 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target creature. The fact that you're getting a board impact from your spells that wouldn't normally impact the board state is a huge deal. Now in this set, there was also the repartee mechanic, which cared about your creatures getting targeted with instants and sorceries. So that made these cards even a little bit better than they normally would be. But the spells as a whole were also just much better because they allowed you to do things with combat while also impacting the game in some other way. Cost of Brilliance could let your 2-drop attack past your opponent's 2-drop while also drawing you cards and keeping you fueled up, especially in like early turns when normally you wouldn't love playing these card draw spells. If this spell didn't have the +1/+1 counter mode on it, it would be very, very weak because you generally don't care about playing these sorts of draw 2s for 3 mana, especially with the life loss attached. Render Speechless, you normally would never want to pay this amount of mana or even 3 mana to just look at your opponent's hand and take one of the cards, but the fact that you're getting these 2 +1/+1 counters and able to turn one of your creatures into a bigger threat, maybe make a creature that was somewhat irrelevant, maybe a 2/2 that was sitting around, into a card your opponent had to deal with, or maybe a small flyer turns into a medium or big flyer all of a sudden, and your opponent has to have an answer, combined with this interaction with their hand. These sorts of spells that impact your creatures on the board state are a big deal, and you should be looking for these in future sets as well. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtags #StrixSecrets because these will help you find success in future formats and are definitely good things to learn from the secrets of Strixhaven draft format. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.